This video is sponsored by the military online game War Thunder. This is the story of Indigo Flight 237. On the 27th of February 2016, an Indigo Airbus A320 was on its way from Ahmedabad to Jaipur, India. Indigo is the country's largest airline with a large fleet of Airbus A320s. The plane was supposed to leave Ahmedabad at 4:10 p.m., but it left 10 minutes ahead of time at 4 p.m. This was a short flight, and by 4:32 p.m. the plane was in contact with Jaipur approach, getting closer and closer to the airport. The first officer was the one that was in control of the plane, while the captain kept watch over what the first officer was doing, and he was monitoring the instruments. The controllers on the ground vectored the plane to a waypoint called Juliet Papa via another waypoint named BUBNU. They were told to expect an ILS approach to runway 27. As the crew acknowledged this, they started the descent down to 11,000 feet. As the plane dropped towards Jaipur, the pilots briefed on the approach that they'd take down to the runway. I imagine they talked about the usual stuff like runway conditions, wind, go-around procedures, that sort of thing. It did not look like they would need to go around though. The weather was good and the winds were calm and they had a ton of visibility. Unless something catastrophically went wrong, they would not have to go around and this plane would be on the ground very shortly. Since the weather was so good, the controllers asked the pilots of Flight 237 if they'd like to opt for a visual approach instead of the ILS approach that they had been assigned. With the conditions being so good, they agreed. A visual approach is not hard if you have weather that is good and if you keep the runway in sight, and then you just take the plane all the way in. If at any point you lose sight of the runway, you just go around. As the pilots took the plane even lower to 3,600 feet, the pilots reported that they had the runway in sight. Perfect, this would be a walk in the park. At this point, they were flying along the airport and they had not lined up with the runway yet. So they had to report to the controllers when they were on the left base leg, which would be right about here. At that point, they would be transferred from approach control to tower control, who would take them all the way in. The plane was in the left downwind pattern and the pilots were slowly starting to bring the flaps in and starting to configure the plane for landing. But before we go further, it's time to thank War Thunder for its support of the channel. Their support truly keeps the channel going. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game. You like planes? Well, take your pick. There's more than 2,000 in the game. Tanks? They got that too. Oh wait, you want naval warfare? Well, you won't believe it, they have that as well. All of these can be used in exciting PvP battles. Each vehicle is rendered right down to the last rivet for maximum realism. And guess what? You can play it right now for free on anything from a PC to an Xbox Series X or S to the PS5 and last-gen consoles. My favorite thing about the game is that it's got a really kick-ass damage model. If someone shoots your wing takes damage. That's something I really enjoy. It really adds to the realism. And don't worry, you can play with what you already have. No extra hardware like joysticks required. My favorite thing to do in War Thunder is to fly the F-14 and recreate scenes from Top Gun. Yeah, I'm a nerd. Give War Thunder a try for free from the link in the description. Use my link to get a large free bonus with multiple premium vehicles, premium account, boosters, and so much more. If you're watching this in July, then War Thunder is teaming up with Atomic Heart. Atomic Heart is a game where a utopian Soviet society is overrun by these superpowered robots rebelling against their creators. You can now fight or control these machines in War Thunder for a limited time. If you're watching this in July, you can get the Atomic Heart content with the link in the description. Now, back to the video. Then the plane started to turn to the left to line up with the runway. The gear was dropped and the plane was configured for landing. As this turn was being made, the autopilot was disabled, which meant that the pilots were now flying the plane. The speed was still managed by the computer though. Flight 237 was now about 4 nautical miles from the runway and the pilots took the plane down. As they descended, the pilots were searching for the runway. The captain then said, "Runway in sight," and asked the first officer to descend further. But as the turn was ending, the first officer was squinting through the sun trying to find the runway, and he was probably not seeing what the captain was seeing. There was no runway to be found. The first officer was starting to worry now, and then he had the scare of his life. They were just 500 feet away from the ground, and he saw the runway. The only problem was that they were not lined up with the runway. The runway was off to the side, but they were lined up with a highway that was to the left of the runway. The captain was asking the first officer to take the plane down to a highway. The first officer had very little time to react. The jet was at 480 feet and it was dropping fast. In a mere 39 seconds, the jet with 173 people on board had dropped another 180 feet. It was at 200 feet. At this point, the captain realized what the first officer had known the whole time, and both pilots called for a go-around simultaneously. Right as they did that, the too low terrain warning came on. That's a warning that you never want to hear in the cockpit. The pilots pushed the engines to max power, and the engines responded, pushing the plane out of its descent. For about 10 seconds, the jet just floated 189 feet above the ground, and then thankfully it started to gain altitude. Once the jet was fully climbing away, the pilots retracted the flaps in the gear, and then they made another approach to runway 27, and they landed safely, this time using an ILS approach to the runway. In this case, I doubt if the passengers on the plane knew how close they were to a disaster, but I doubt it. Before we go further, let's talk about how this approach should have been carried out. You'd fly along the runway called the downwind leg. Then, when you were abeam of the runway that you wanted to land on, you'd wait for about 45 seconds and then start the left-hand turn to line up with the runway. Now, you couldn't just turn willy-nilly. You had to follow some parameters during the turn. You had to be at a 20-degree bank of turn along with a 400 feet per minute rate of descent. After a while, you could increase that rate of descent to about 700 feet per minute once you were established on the right path down to the runway. All the while you did this, you'd bring out the gear and flaps at the right time to get the plane safely on the ground. So all of this begs the question, how did a modern airliner, one that is very popular around the world, not line up properly with the runway? What in that chain that I just described to you earlier went wrong? If this had happened in reduced visibility like that of a thunderstorm, then there's a very real possibility that this plane could have flown into the highway, and that would have caused untold damage in terms of both lives and property. So here's the first thing that they looked at, the navigational aids of the airport. They checked to see if a malfunctioning beacon could have sent the plane on the wrong path, but all of the navigational aids at Jaipur checked out, and none of those aids would send the plane off course. Looking at the flight data, they saw that the plane flew the downwind leg for 60 seconds as opposed to the 45 seconds that was needed. This put them further away from the runway when they lined up with the runway. In addition to that, the bank angle was higher than prescribed as well. If you recall, the pilots had to make the turn at 20 degrees of bank, but on this turn, they made the turn at 29.2 degrees. That is well above what the manuals called for. This meant that the crew did not follow the visual approach procedure that was laid out in the air operating manual. But that on its own doesn't explain the accident. Sure, they did not hit the parameters that they needed to, but it just meant that they wouldn't line up with the runway where they expected to. The lineup would happen a bit downwind than usual. So then, what gives? That's where the second part of this incident comes into play, the time of day. You see, they were landing on runway 27. For the nerds out there, you know that it means that the heading of the runway is due west. And since they were landing in the evening, it would mean that they would be landing right into the sun, which would impede their visibility quite a bit. In that case, why did they decide to disengage the autopilot and fly the plane down to the runway without using the ILS as backup? That would have helped them so much in this situation. In fact, that is what Indigo's company policy had to say on the matter. Quote, flight crew are advised to back up the visual approach with ILS approach indicators, if available for that runway. This to ensure that the aircraft is aligned to the active runway and the correct profile is being flown. End quote. That did not happen that day. They did not do that. And if they had done that, then they would have known that flight 237 was not lined up with runway 27. In this case, the captain who was looking out for the runway was from the armed forces, and he had then transitioned into commercial flying, and this was his first landing at Jaipur in over 2 years. So he didn't remember that there was a road parallel to the runway. Thus, when he saw the runway, he saw something in the general direction of where he was looking, and he just assumed that it was a runway, and then he instructed the first officer to take the airplane towards the highway. With the way the cockpit was set up, the first officer would not have been able to see the runway during the base turn or the final lineup. When he did not see the runway, the first officer should have been like, "Wait, I can't see the runway. Your airplane." The first officer was not vocal about his concerns to the captain. Here's what the final report had to say. There was a lack of assertiveness on the part of the first officer. When he did not have the runway in sight, he continued the descent and did not consider handing over the controls. Also, the pilot in command did not consider the input from the first officer. In other words, he was not receptive. End quote. Ultimately, all of this comes down to communication. We should have a culture of communication in our cockpits that allows a junior officer to go, "This isn't right, let's go around." In the case of Flight 237, that go-around call should have been made quite early on in the approach. not when they were 189 feet off the ground. Had they wasted any more time searching for the runway, then this would have ended in disaster. This has happened before. Take the case of Alitalia Flight 404. Alitalia Flight 404 was very similar to Indigo Flight 237, in the case that the first officer knew that something was wrong and he tried to go around. But in that case, the captain prevented the first officer from going around by saying, "Hold the glide." And unfortunately, in that case, the plane ended up crashing into a mountain. Something very similar could have happened here, but thankfully it did not. This is why proposals to fly planes with just one pilot is so dangerous. Sure, automation is getting to a point where you could technically engineer a solution that can do the task done by the non-flying pilot, like checklists and stuff, but I doubt that an algorithm could look at on call for a go-around if things get too dicey. If you want to watch another video like this one, then how about the video about a GoAir A320 that almost crashed into Bangalore? You can find the link on your screen right now. What do you think about all of this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Again, a huge shout out to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. This video would not have been possible without their support, so go check them out with the link in the description. Don't forget, if you're on PC, then you can get a large free bonus pack by using my link. Thank you for watching this episode of Mini Air Crash Investigation. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help the channel grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.